Alright, in this video, I want to cover a few developments in German politics, things that have happened over the past few days. I've been focused on some other countries, some elections that have been happening in the UK, Romania, of course, the big presidential elections. But of course, after the German election, we do have the final formation of the government. And one of the biggest news stories is that Friedrich Merz has finally become the German Chancellor. He's been elected to serve, succeeding Olaf Scholz, and he will lead his CDU, CSU, SPD, his grand coalition, for at least the next 4 years, assuming this government survives, assuming there's not early elections, and depending on how the next election goes, we could see Friedrich Merz be Germany's next chancellor for anywhere as early as 3 or 4 years like Olaf Scholz was, or even maybe 12, 16 years like some of the former CDU chancellors Angela Merkel and Helmut Kohl were in the past. So we don't know. Friedrich Merz has struggled with his popularity, and what's more important, what's more almost significant than the fact that he was elected was that the fact that he failed the initial vote, which is something very unprecedented because what had happened was Friedrich Merz was put up for the vote in the Bundestag, and his coalition had already been basically approved. He already had a coalition of his CDU, CSU parties behind him, and then the SPD as the coalition partner, which holds a majority in the Bundestag. And they, of course, were going to vote to basically confirm Friedrich Merz in chancellor, and was expected for him to get across the line because his coalition has a majority, and he is the leader of that coalition. However, in the first ballot, he only got around 310 of the 318, 317 needed, and he basically failed. And what this has meant was that they had to go into a second ballot for this initial vote for chancellor. And this is definitely very humiliating, a big defeat for Merz, because this has not happened at this stage. It's been the case in the past that chancellors have been voted out by the Bundestag, their coalition has collapsed, there's been votes of no confidences, there's been minority governments, and of course, when you run a minority government, it's very likely that you can get voted out in a motion of confidence or a motion of no confidence. However, for Friedrich Merz to fail to get elected on the first ballot when his coalition itself has a majority shows that even from day one, there's already breaks in the coalition. There's already people within maybe the CSU, but most likely the SPD, that are unhappy with Friedrich Merz and do not want him. Now, in the second ballot, they managed to swing over the majority of those defectors, and I believe they went from 310 to around 325. So still a few below what the actual coalition is. So that means there's a few members of either the SPD or the CDU, CSU who are voting against Merz and do not like him. But the majority is of the Bundestag within this, this coalition is on board for Merz at the time being. But this has definitely hurt him because, for him being very unpopular, his approval rating, his popularity is definitely lower than previous chancellors has been, and he's not seen any honeymoon phase as, being a new chancellor that's just come off of an electoral victory. And so Friedrich Merz is going into this, the beginning of his electoral term, the beginning of this 4 years with this new Bundestag, this new government, being very unpopular. And both the parties have been, the CDU and the SPD have struggled in the polls. And for this to happen kind of delegitimizes him, shows that even in his own coalition, he doesn't have complete control and complete trust from his own parties. And so this has definitely hurt Friedrich Merz. Of course, there's been some calls by the AfD and some other parties to hold new elections or to have, the CDU replace Merz because this was a big defeat for him. But nonetheless, on the second ballot, he was able to be elected, and he is now the Chancellor of Germany. And this, this doesn't mean that he's going to be voted out anytime soon, but it does show weakness, and it does show that the long-term vitality of this coalition is going to come into question. And it is very possible we could see a collapse of the government. We could see a divide between the SPD and the CDU, and even new elections before the 4-year period ends. Now, if we take a look at the Bundestag itself, we see there's 630 seats, and I believe that the coalition parties together control around 328 of them. He got 325, which was over a majority, but not all of the seats he needed. And then we have, of course, the AfD, the Greens, and Die Linke that form the kind of the various opposition groups. So the Grand Coalition, it is somewhat more of a stable majority in that it's going between two parties. So if there's a divide in the coalition, there's only two parties, whereas the previous coalition, the Tripartite Coalition, you had three different political parties, all with different leaders, all with different interests and different voters that they were trying to basically satisfy and meet the demands for. And so this coalition will be somewhat more simple, as in somewhat more stable in that it has only two parties. However, it does not have a massive majority in the Bundestag. And if you see here, if there's maybe over 10, 15 defectors from either the CDU or the SPD, that could run them into serious trouble of losing votes, no longer having a majority to pass certain bills through. And if people are already voting against the chancellor, the kind of leader of this coalition, it's very likely we could see votes within the coalition parties against certain bills or laws proposed by the Grand Coalition. So this definitely is a bad sign for the beginning of this new government. This definitely is a show of weakness, a show of instability, but I think it's something that we kind of anticipated. German politics has been very unstable. There's been a lot of unprecedented things happening, coalitions that have to be formed because the AfD, Die Linke, other parties have made, the forming of traditional coalitions a lot more difficult. So this was kind of something that we could, expect to happen in German politics for, a long time. The other story I wanted to cover was regarding the AfD. Now, Germany's domestic intelligence agency has classified the Alternative for Germany as a right-wing extremist organization. And this is something they've done to a few of the branches of the AfD in some of the East German states, in Thuringia and Saxony. And this has a number of implications. Of course, this is something that they do to political parties or political organizations they say being extremist, anti-democratic. Now, this has been a very highly politicized discussion and topic within the country. Of course, many people on the left, many people from the government, parties from the CDU, the SPD, from parties outside the government, from Die Linke, the Greens, many activists on the political left have supported this, have said that the AfD has been a right-wing extremist group for a long time, and that the AfD needs to be stopped by either the institutions, by the police agencies, or the courts itself. And whereas on the other side, the AfD, and some even outside the AfD, has said that this is, an attempt by the government, by the establishment, to basically entrench itself, to ensure that the AfD, now that they're the opposition, doesn't have the chance to overtake the government, to take over the government from the SPD and the CDU. And, so this is definitely something highly politicized. The courts and the intelligence agency, these institutions are, of course, always supposed to be neutral, but they're always controlled indirectly by a different political party. They're appointed by people from political parties over years. And so, of course, this is going to be, even though it's between the German intelligence agencies and the AfD, it is lining up to be kind of a clash between the AfD as the leading kind of this anti-government opposition, like being, the main populist force outside the government, and some of the traditional establishment parties, the SPD and the CDU. Now, this has a number of implications, and the main thing people are talking about is that this is something that the intelligence agencies need to do in order to ban the AfD, because in order for a political party to be banned, which the discussion over banning the AfD has occurred in the past, however, no one has really gone through with it. But in order for them to ban the AfD, this is kind of something they need. They need to have the party as confirmed right-wing extremist, to use that as a justification for banning the party itself. Now, I want to take a look at the polls real quick. Now, the polling of the AfD has arguably played a lot into this, and both sides of the argument are claiming that this is one of the reasons why this has happened. People from the AfD and people supporting the AfD are claiming that, of course, now that the AfD has risen to, a close second in the polls, or even first place in the polls, the governing parties of the CDU and the SPD are scared. They're afraid that they might lose power. They're afraid that a party outside the government, a party that has never held power, a party from the outside, might be able to win the next elections, might be able to put forward a chancellor, take over a lot of these institutions. And so they are trying to stop the AfD through the institutions because they don't think they can beat them in an election. And on the other hand, people that oppose the AfD, people from maybe the government itself, but also people from left-wing organizations outside the party, from the trade unions, maybe from Die Linke or the Greens that are no longer that are not in government, are saying that the AfD is a dangerous force, and even though it might be able to win a democratic election, it must be challenged through other institutions, because if it wins these elections, it might be able to use that power against the other parties, or to threaten German democracy. So the fact that the AfD has risen to first place is definitely being used. It's definitely playing into it. Now, party bans have occurred in the past. There was a ban on the German Communist Party, and I believe another party that was a kind of a successor to the Nazi Party back in the 50s. However, both of those political parties were somewhat small. They had around 2 to 5% in elections. They had a few city councilors and local and state representatives. But the AfD is a completely different story, because the AfD is the second largest party in the Bundestag. They have representation all across the country, and if it were to be banned, it would be unprecedented. Now, this is not the fact that the AfD is classified as right-wing extremist does not mean that they're going to be banned anytime soon. However, it is very possible, and this is the kind of step in that direction. Now, if the AfD itself is banned, it is possible for politicians from the party to go and form another political party to sit as independents. But it is, like I said, going to be very unprecedented. Something like this has not happened in modern German politics, and really any major European country. And for this to happen would change a lot in especially in Eastern Germany, where you have some of the local and state councils, Some of the city councils and some of the state legislatures have 20, 30, even 40% AfD representation. So if the AfD is banned as a political force, it's going to have drastic implications. But I don't think that that's going to happen just yet. It is very possible, but it's kind of yet to be seen whether or not the governing parties, the constitutional courts, the intelligence agencies will go forward with that. There are people who want to ban the AfD, and there's people who are critical of the AfD who do not want to ban it, and there's people who are, of course, kind of in the middle. So it's not necessarily just the AfD against the other parties that are against it. There's some people in the CDU, some people maybe in the SPD that are, very against the AfD, but they think that maybe banning it is too far. They maybe think there's not, enough legal grounds. The BSV has been very critical of the AfD in the Bundestag on certain policies, but they, of course, have said that, when they were in the Bundestag, but they've said that banning the AfD is a huge mistake. It will only radicalize German politics even further. So that's going to be it for this situation. Of course, like I said, this is something that's happened to some of the AfD branches in the past. This is definitely a highly politicized challenge between the AfD, which is now, kind of this right-wing bloc, and also an opposition establishment bloc against some of the other parties, against both the left, the kind of left-wing activists, and the government, which is now run by the CDU-CSU. So definitely an interesting situation, and once we get more updates, I will, of course, cover it. I will also probably try and do a video on the new coalition government, some of the new ministers, some of the people involved in the Merz coalition, but I've been somewhat focusing on these elections in Poland, in Romania, but once we get, through those, I'll cover over some German politics some more. Maybe look at the polls for some of the state elections and some of the local elections that will happen sometime later this year. But that's going to be it for this video. Like I said, once we get more updates on this situation, I will, of course, make a video on that as well. So that's going to be it. I hope you all like the video. If you do, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you all for watching.